I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the death toll from Monday night's strike on Kyiv climbs, we report reaction from the United States, plus why we should be paying attention to the St Petersburg Economic Forum, and we hear how Moscow has taken aim at Britain's new head of MI6.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 18th of June, 3 years and 115 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's former Russia correspondent James Kilner and chemical weapons expert and former tank unit commander Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. I started with the latest military and political updates. Let's go back to Kyiv. The death toll from the overnight strikes Monday-Tuesday, that's the third largest combined drone and missile strike against Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion, has increased today to 28, with nearly 150 injured. Kyiv City Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said remnants of cluster munitions had been found at the site of some of the impacts. Cluster munitions in civilian areas. Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko yesterday had revised the death toll down to 10, but that number subsequently went back up, explaining the confusion over the numbers and to give you an idea of what lies behind these grim statistics that get reported every day. Mr. Klimenko said that operational data may change as body parts found during rescue efforts can sometimes be mistakenly counted as multiple victims. Now, I'm sorry for the graphic nature of that quote, but this is daily life in Ukraine as Russia continues to try to wipe out the country. So apologies if that is a particularly graphic quote, but we've got to talk about it, get behind the numbers. Now, this morning, the US Embassy in Ukraine said in a statement, today, with all of Ukraine, we join a day of mourning in Kyiv for the victims of Russia's June 17th attack. We extend deepest condolences to the victims' families. This senseless attack runs counter to President Trump's call to stop the killing and end the war. I thought that was an interesting quote from the US Embassy in Ukraine, referencing President Trump and naming Russia. Doesn't go any further, though. No mention there of the US citizen that was killed in the attack. However, US State Department Press Secretary Tammy Bruce did say in a briefing last night, quote, "We are aware of last night's attack on Kyiv, which resulted in numerous casualties, including the tragic death of a US citizen. We condemn those strikes and extend our deepest condolences to the victims and to the families of all those affected." So they did reference the killing, the murder of the US citizen. No statement yet from the White House about that. Now then, on the ground, over the last 24 hours, Russian forces in the area of Sumy have expanded the lodgement there slightly. They pushed out to the southeast of the land that they were holding. However, that is the border up there. Have they pushed to the southeast or just come across the border at that bit and added a couple of square kilometres? Not sure. Probably irrelevant, as it amounts to the same thing. The line there is still about 20 kilometres north of the city of Sumy. Elsewhere, there's a small Russian advance to create a bulge in that line halfway between Pokrovsk and Toretsk in the Donbass. So the front line in that area is roughly northeast to southwest, running from Bakhmut down into Zaporizhia Oblast. But the cities of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka have formed hard shoulders, and Russian forces are being held back there. So effectively, if you imagine a line that would be straight were it not for the defensive efforts of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, that is not straight because of those two bulges where the cities are holding out. So there's a big sort of blob of Russian forces to the southwest of Pokrovsk and also to the northeast, that area I've just described between there and Toretsk, and then also to the northeast of Konstantinivka. Now, last night saw Ukraine attacked with 58 Shahed-type drones. The attacks range from sort of Chernihiv in the north through the Donbass and Dnipropetrovsk areas down to Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. 6 people killed, nearly 50 injured, authorities said this morning. Now, yesterday, you may remember we reported how Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko had said in an interview with the state-run newspaper Izvestia earlier this week that Ukraine must destroy or dismantle all Western-supplied weapons as a condition for a ceasefire. Earlier today, Ukraine's foreign ministry, I don't know why they felt the need to comment, but they brushed off Moscow's demands. Spokesperson Yuri Chiko saying Russian officials make new absurd demands almost every day. Total inadequacy. Moscow shows complete disregard for the United States' efforts to end the war. Now, I've got a slightly wonkish, but I think quite an important story that's running today on the Kyiv Independent. So earlier today, Ukraine's parliament passed a reform of the Asset Recovery and Management Agency. This is a key step toward integration with Europe and the EU, and a condition listed in the EU's Ukraine Facility Plan. More on that in a moment. Anti-corruption experts, lawmakers and Transparency International have all backed these reforms. Now, this legislation passed after months of debate, but it's unblocked 600 million euros, about 690 million US dollars in EU funds. The agency, so the Asset Recovery and Management Agency, is Ukraine's national agency tasked with locating, recovering and managing assets seized in criminal proceedings, namely during corruption cases. So you can imagine it is fraught with difficulty if you get the wrong people in there. Proposed reforms include stricter qualification standards for leadership candidates, independent external audits, and the use of certified professionals held legally accountable for mismanagement. Now, the Ukraine Facility is an EU programme providing Ukraine with 50 billion euros, big B billion, 58 billion US dollars, in a multi-year financial support that's contingent on reforms, hence them wanting to get their stuff in one sock. Now, on those continued efforts to reform and root out corruption, Ukraine's parliament yesterday approved President Zelensky's nomination of 35-year-old Ruslan Kravchenko as the country's new prosecutor general, making him the youngest person to ever hold the post. Mr. Kravchenko is a former military prosecutor and most recently was head of Ukraine's tax service. He replaces Andrei Kostin, who stepped down in October last year following a scandal involving fraudulent disability claims by dozens of prosecutors in Hmelnytskyi Oblast. There was an investigation by the Ukrainian media that revealed at least 50 prosecutors there had allegedly received disability status fraudulently. Mr. Kravchenko is going to be pretty busy as the Prosecutor General, as his office plays a central role in documenting Russian war crimes. No doubt we'll hear of him again. Okay, a couple more, looking more broadly on the diplomatic front and the external front. An invitation for Ukraine to become a member of NATO is not on the agenda of the upcoming summit in The Hague. This comes from Lithuanian Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys, speaking in an interview with the Baltic News Service that was published earlier today. He said, "This issue is certainly not on the NATO agenda, and nobody has formulated an expectation that there will be an invitation in The Hague, nor have we heard that from the Ukrainians themselves. There is no such expectation that there will be a breakthrough decision, neither before the Washington summit nor now before the Hague summit. It's not on the agenda." I think that's pretty clear then. I think the message is coming through, Mr. Budrys. Anyway, I don't think NATO membership, the hard yes-no NATO membership for Ukraine was ever really going to be formally on the agenda. Always worth looking out to see if there's a reference to it in the final communique. There's talk of it not being in the final communique this time because that might upset Donald Trump, but we shall see. And also worth noting a story in yesterday's Guardian from here in the UK. Citing unnamed Ukrainian officials, they say President Zelensky may not now bother going to The Hague himself, questioning whether his presence would be worthwhile without a confirmed meeting with Donald Trump. We saw how he didn't have a meeting at the G7 summit in Canada recently. Yeah, it's always good to go and see your politician pals and what have you, but actually at what point does that become unhelpful if it looks like a snub, if the US president doesn't bother turning up or doesn't bother meeting you? So, to forestall that, Zelensky might not be going to the NATO summit, although the US has still not confirmed that Donald Trump will be going. Okay, a couple more for me. One to point out, I thought this was interesting. George Degenhardt, and I apologise if I've got the chap's name wrong, he's the head of the defence aviation giant Eurofighter. He said that the company plans to increase the annual rate of Typhoon fighter jet production from 12 to 20 and then potentially to 30 to accommodate anticipated new sales in response to, quote, the total madness of the current geopolitical situation. He was speaking at the Paris Air Show that's on at the moment. It's on this week, runs all the way through to Sunday. Thank you to freelance aviation journalist Gareth Jennings for spotting that. I thought that was quite refreshing. You get these CEOs and if they were going to make any comment at all, they'd say something about the anticipated future challenges of emerging likely geopolitical waffle. Mr. Degenhardt comes out and says, the world's gone mad, which I thought was quite refreshing from a CEO and very accurate. More of that, please, and not the madness. Now, the last one for me, Ukraine is one of 6 countries to have submitted expressions of interest to host the Invictus Games in 2029. So announced yesterday at the Olympic Museum in Lausanne in Switzerland, the Invictus Games Foundation said that Denmark, Italy, Nigeria, the Republic of Korea, Ukraine and the US have all submitted bids to host the event. The Invictus Games, you'll remember, take place biennially and use sport to aid recovery for wounded, injured and sick service personnel and veterans. Now, in what might be described as a tiny understatement, the organisers said, quote, notwithstanding the complex ongoing geopolitical challenges, Ukraine has submitted a compelling expression of interest for hosting a future Invictus Games. Natalia Kalmykova, she's Ukraine's Minister for Foreign Affairs, said sport is a key function in veterans' healthcare. It's thanks to our relationship with Invictus that we established and continue to develop the role of sports in recovery in Ukraine and why it's included in the veteran policy strategy. Now, the next Invictus Games is going to be in Birmingham in the UK in July 2027, and shortlisting for those 29 games will take place later this year, with the selected host city unveiled in summer next year. So we'll keep an eye on that. Anyway, enough for me. Delighted now to turn over to the brains of the outfit, Hamish and James. Hamish, let's start with you, if we may. This appalling strike Monday night. And as I said earlier on, Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said that cluster munitions were used. What have you been seeing on that front?
Good afternoon, Dom. Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to be back on the pod. Yeah, on the cluster munitions piece, saw Vitaly Klitschko's piece, but also there's some videos of the social media about the explosions themselves. I'll come back to why, but for those of you who are not fully up to speed on cluster munitions, these are munitions that are fired either from the ground or the air. As they approach their target, the casing splits and then hundreds of tiny bomblets fall to the ground and either explode on impact, or some of them have delay fuses, and some of the older versions are not very capable. So you get a whole load of bomblets that don't go off. And the real firing into civilian areas is such a cynical thing, quite apart from killing civilians anyway, which is against international humanitarian law. These bomblets are very tactile. They're small cylindrical devices that would fit easily in a hand, or small balls about the size of a tennis ball, and Klitschko's holding a few of those up. And certainly historically in conflict areas, sort of thing that young kids pick up, and these things go off, and one of them certainly enough to kill a child. So it's interesting why in civilian, and the final thing on this before I go on to why, they are banned by international humanitarian law, and there is a convention against them signed by a lot of people in 2010. Interestingly, though, not the Russians. And just why, Dom, they might be doing it. We've discussed before, certainly my experience is coming up against the Russians in Syria. You know, their playbook, their modus operandi was very much about attacking civilian areas because they believed if you kill enough civilians, then they capitulate. And we've seen this throughout the conflict. But cluster munitions is a strange one. You know, why you would have thought they'd use them more extensively on the sort of trench network, on the contact line. But purely firing them at civilians is hugely cynical. And I suppose also, why is it? Because they are being attrited so much. We understand the Ukrainians are knocking about 90% of the missiles and drones fired at them. Do they now need to go here? But I think generally it is hugely cynical, and let's hope this is the last we see of them. But I doubt it. There is a good video for people to look at that really shows how they explode when they get to the ground, and absolutely devastating. Over.
It certainly is. I mentioned yesterday when we first saw the reports, but also reiterated it again today. Do you think it's as significant that a US citizen has been killed? Not a volunteer fighting at the front, but a civilian in Kyiv killed yesterday. A 62-year-old man, we are told. There was a couple of comments, as I said there, no direct reference to the individual from the US embassy in Ukraine, but there was that State Department comment. Do you think this is actually going to do anything? Will the US make any will it change the dial at all?
We shall see. I might talk about a bit later on some of the stuff I've been writing about, but the fact that we know about this and this has been publicised, I think there is a great concern, particularly in Ukraine and those of us in Europe, that the focus is so much off Ukraine at the moment with what is happening in the Middle East. But this is knowing, or not knowing, but surmising how President Trump operates. This is the sort of thing that may well get his attention. I think obviously everybody killed over the last 24, the whole time, is desperate. An American being killed, this is something that will no doubt resonate around the White House. And let's hope the American president can focus on Ukraine as well as the Middle East.
Yeah, I think you're a bit more optimistic than me on that one, but as you say, we will see. Now, I know you've had a few thoughts on Operation Spiderweb, this amazing the attack, 2.5 weeks ago now on the Sunday, just after we arrived in Odessa. This is Ukraine getting first-person view drones smuggled into Russia and attacking. I think they attacked 5 airfields, but for one reason, the attack on the airfield in the far east of Russia didn't go off as planned, but they did have a devastating impact on the other 4. But what were your thoughts? Because we've not spoken since then. What did you take from Operation Spiderweb?
I try not to cover old ground that you covered, and having listened to your comments, that absolutely spot on. I think I was also slightly relating it to Operation Rising Sun, which is the Israeli operation ongoing at the moment in Iran. There are many similarities, and not suggesting, of course, that the SBU and the HUR have been trained or learned anything from Mossad. I think this type of operation, which sort of harps back to the SOE, the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War, where you get people deep behind enemy lines for protracted periods so that you can construct operations, is hugely impressive. And we know that Spider's Web was, I think, 18 months or at least 12 months in the planning, which it would need to be in the depth that they've got in there. I found it very striking that they've been able to do this. To me, this sort of shows that there are quite a lot of people in Russia who are happy to help the Ukraine Secret Service and are happy to enable them. So I think that's hugely significant. And the way they've been able to operate, it strikes that almost most of the Russian military and security effort is focused on Ukraine, which of course has exposed them in depth. And as you and I would describe it, this is preparation of the battlefield in depth so that it can enable other operations. And of course, we're talking about nuclear really focused on Iran at the moment, but now that Putin has lost some of his strategic jets that could carry his tactical nuclear weapons and moved the rest so far away that they're out of range of Ukraine, to me that has, and because we've discussed how often Putin and his other lapdogs mention the nuclear word, you now realise you might have been able to strap a tactical nuke to one of these bombers and set it off in a couple of hours' notice. You can't do that now. So again, I think that was hugely significant. I think when I compare it to Rising Sun, the operation in Iran, what strikes me and what is lacking for the Ukrainians is very much air power. If they had the air power to follow up, things might be very different here, and clearly they don't. And if the Americans flex their air power muscle as they are doing over Iran at the moment, again, things might be very different. I think the irony, and I know Steve Rosenberg, the BBC's correspondent in Russia, posted a piece on the BBC website today about what Russian newspapers are saying, not just about this, but also about what's happening in Iran, that it's playing in. The Russians are quite happy. The price of oil has gone to $80 plus, which $40 he couldn't sustain his military, now he can. And irony beyond parody, Putin's offer himself up as the honest broker to do a deal. But slightly going off the pitch here. But yes, Spider's Web, let's hope there are many other tenets to this spider's web as well, which are ongoing. But I think it's hugely significant because of its strategic impact. I've mentioned the nuclear piece, but it is a way to undermine, I think, the authority of the Kremlin, and also to start hairs running. And the final piece on this, Dom, is the disinformation and propaganda system that is part of everything the Russians do, but they just haven't been able to really get anything positive out of this, apart from calling the Ukrainians terrorists for attacking deep into Russia. And we've just been speaking about them firing cluster munitions at civilian neighbourhoods in Kyiv. Unbelievably ironic parody there. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. Now, before we go to James, I just want to, if you'll forgive me, folks, just want to be a little bit UK-centric for a moment. We've got the Land Warfare Conference on this week, and Britain's head of the army, Chief of the General Staff, Rowley Walker, gave a speech yesterday. Danielle was there for us. Rather annoyingly, whilst the speech was on the record, and it's fairly bland, as these things are, all the real good stuff comes in. The Q&A was off the record for the first time that any of us could remember. This was number 10 rather than MOD, gagging the way that the event was run. Anyway, so it was very annoying to be tracking that with my pals across the defence correspondent community. But Hamish, I think you were there, and I saw Rowley's speech. He was talking about, I think the central idea was what he called the three-ring source of lethality, which I thought was a bad 80s death metal band from Wigan, but apparently that's the new strategy about how the British Army is going to deliver death and destruction to the King's enemies. You were there, I believe, Hamish. What did you take from the conference and from CGS's speech?
I must admit, first of all, I confirm I wasn't actually there, but I am quite closely affiliated to it. And you mentioned number 10, and what I'm involved with something called the Land Exploitation Cell, which is the organisation that works out what is happening in Ukraine and around the world and how it should reflect what we do. And really, I've just found out today that actually number 10 have given them permission to come on the pod at a future date to explain some of these things, hopefully in some sort of granular detail that perhaps has not come out. Now, the MOD have put up General Rowley's speech on the web, but I think what I would take from it, I think it's, if I was super cynical and with my Telegraph hat on rather than any other particular hat, I'm very aware that President Putin once did say to me, or put out in social media, what particular hat is the Bretton-Gordon wearing today, but this is very much with my sort of Telegraph hat on. And it's slightly alluded to in Rowley's speech. Everything that he's talking about and SDR's talking about, I don't think anybody really thinks we're going to get that for 2.6% of GDP. And I don't think anybody really wants to go into the detail of that. But I personally think SDR is a really good piece of work and a really good reflection of what we require. And Rowley's articulation of that, I think in his speech, was really good as well. But it's this idea that we'll probably need to spend 5% to realise it. But on the three tenets, they're looking at what they call 25%. First of all, Rowley said he wants to double lethality by 2027 and treble it by 2030, which actually is possible. And that's done by having 20% of your lethality survival. He's talking about tanks and attack helicopters, Apaches here. And then 40% of what's called attritable, in other words, can lose it. And this is the more sort of expensive type drones, the sort of Hermes and Watchkeeper. And then 40% consumable, which is your sort of $500 drones. Interestingly enough, when we look at how things are operating in Ukraine at the moment, and certainly from our time in the army, Dom, it's such a different type of operation. The MOD, or Rowley, saying they've trained 3,000 drone pilots in the last 12 months and will have trained 6,000 by the end of this year. That is a hugely impressive piece. It's interesting, I do talk about the funding a little bit. 50% of that funding, whether it's whatever percentage it's going to be, is going to go on the 20%, the tanks and aircraft, because they are so very expensive and so much effort has got to be put into defensive aid suites for all these things now, because of the other 80%, as it were, because of the attack drones. So 50% of the budget is going to go on 80% of the capability, these attritable and also the consumable side of it. I think it was a really difficult articulation of SDR without necessarily all the resources involved. I think the other thing to me that was really important is the focus on training. Now, I'm doing a piece at the Chalk History Festival next week with Jim Holland and a few others, and Mick Ryan, on the ineptitude of the Russian military. James Holland's talking about Second World War. I'm talking about really the here and now. And to me, a lot of it is training. This operating in this current environment that we're seeing in Ukraine with drones, intelligence, air power, a nod to the Operation Spider's Web. Yeah, this doesn't, you just can't pick up and run with this. You need to train and train and train. And if you don't, you will not realize all these capabilities and be able to put them together. And there is a huge emphasis on training and the amount of training that's required. I think in the past, when defence budgets have been really badly squeezed, the first thing to go is eventually training, fair enough. But then it's really training, and the recognition of that, I think, is hugely important. Yeah, and I'm sure people can find the link to the speech from the MOD. Yeah, do read it. I think it's really good, and I think CGS, Chief of the General Staff, is spot on here. I just hope our political leaders, and a lot of them were at Russia yesterday, will get the vibe that we won't get this on 2.6%. It's going to be closer to 5%. What did you think, Dom?
Yeah, I was looking at that. I did have to go back and make some notes, but this idea of the three-ring source of lethality, 20% being the heavy metal platforms that have a crew, so crewed platforms, not CRUDE, but CREWED, as you say, the tanks, helicopters and what have you, and then 40% on autonomous systems that you don't really want to lose if you don't have to, but hasn't got a warm pink body inside it, and then 40% of autonomous sacrificial stuff, as you say, the consumables, the FPV drones, that kind of thing. I thought that was an interesting model, and again, as you say, 50% of the funding of the money will go on the heavy metal, and another 50% on those two bits of autonomy. So, a lot of money, a huge amount of money. Compared to the last time we did a proper SDR, if you like, 98, I guess, maybe 2010, but all the others have been just a little bit kind of deck chairs on the Titanic. The autonomous systems were just they just didn't feature anything like this degree because they just weren't around. To make this kind of model and commit that amount of cash, 50% of your budget onto autonomous systems, is huge. And of course, the consumable bit there, the sacrificial FPV end of it, those are going to be, as they'll need to be because of the rate of advance in technology, they'll be used up every year on these exercises that hopefully now there'll be more training. So these things will be smashed up. You can imagine the exercise. You don't have to put warm pink bodies down the far end of the range because they might get hit by one of these things, but you could have automatic weapon systems trying to bring them down and see if the drones get through. So these things are going to be used big time and spent, used, chucked away, fail fast, fail better, all this good mantra. Is it finally coming to a head and it being incorporated as a culture in the military rather than just a nice buzzword to be said at a conference? But it does come back to the cash flow, as you say. And I'm a bit concerned about money at the moment, this idea that 2.6%, 3%, what have you. The NATO summit is going to pledge a spending commitment of 5%, 3.5% on heavy metal, 1.5% on additional defence spending, i.e. infrastructure, making the roads better, the bridges, so you can move the stuff east, quite frankly. I think cyber is going to be wrapped up in that as well. Rather worryingly, the government here have started making noises about intelligence and security agencies being somewhere in that, either in 3.5 or the 1.5. Of course, they get their own vote. They get their own budget allocation. The intelligence agencies, MI6, we'll come on to that a little bit later with James. They get their own money, so it'll be really cheap of this government to start including intelligence functions as part of the defence spending if they have to make some noise about 5%. And I just wonder if by going for such a big number, the US is not at 5%, for example, but if you come out with a number like 5%, does that not just encourage bad behaviour and encourage governments to go, oh, right, I'll tell you what, let's add a little bit of policing, let's have a little bit of security, some intelligence. It's going to be smoke and mirrors. And I wonder if they've gone for something maybe a little bit more rational, 4%, 4.5%, where there would be more willingness to go, okay, let's have a serious think about this. What are we going to do? I just wonder, we'll see what kind of noise comes out NATO next month. But I expect bad behaviours, and I think we might be starting to see it already at a time just when you get speeches like from Rowley Walker, CGS, Chief of the General Staff, that's really starting to draw these themes together of autonomy and properly funded exercises and bring it all together in terms of experimentation and bringing it into the core function of the military. I wonder if we're about to, just when it's within our grasp, just decide to kick the can down the road and start fudging figures all over again. But that's going to be, sorry folks, that's the first rant. You're going to hear it again a lot more often as we get towards NATO. But Hamish, thank you so much. Do stick around if you're able to for final thoughts at the end. We'd love to hear from you. But James, really, thanks for coming on. Thanks for hanging about. Really keen to hear from you. So much going on that comes from your deep specialisation, Russia. I want to start, if I may. Can we just look just a little bit outside Ukraine? What is the Kremlin saying about the ongoing Israel-Iran conflict? How's that being portrayed in the Russian media? Welcome, James.
Hi, Dom. Hi, Hamish. Yeah, obviously this is the big story of the moment in Russia as it is around the rest of the world. As Hamish already noted, it's a complicated story for the Kremlin. On the face of it, it looks like a very negative problem. They've got Iran, as your listeners already well know, Dom has been a key Russia ally for its war in Ukraine under unprecedented attack. The Kremlin has already criticised the Israeli attacks on Iran, called them illegal and called for them to stop, etc. Putin has put himself forward as a potential peacemaker or mediator, again allowing him to play the peacemaker, the role he's really keen on portraying to the Russian people. He also spoke to Trump over the weekend, 50-minute phone call. I think it was the fifth phone call since Trump took over the presidency. And the Kremlin made the point that a lot of this phone call was discussing the situation in the Middle East. The Kremlin's also said that Putin expects to speak to Chinese President Xi about the Israel-Iran conflict later this week. We haven't got any more details on that. We haven't got a time, but the fact that it's been flagged up is important for your listeners to know that Russia and China are going to discuss this issue together. And also Sergei Shoigu, he's the Secretary of Russia's National Security Council. He was back in North Korea yesterday for his second visit in less than 2 weeks. That is, to put that into context, that was his third time, I think, this year in North Korea. So this visit to Pyongyang seems to have been rushed through a last-minute meeting although some other deals were signed, some sort of bells and whistles deals were signed around this meeting, and I'll come into those a bit later. I would assume that he was also there to discuss North Korea reaction to the Israeli attacks on Iran. As we know, Iran, North Korea and Russia are very much, in the Western US mind, seen as the sort of the axis of evil, the sort of anti-Western axis. And one pole of this axis, one pillar of this axis is under great attack. In the Russian media, which sort of follows the Kremlin line, Israel is being portrayed as the great aggressor. This is front page news in Russian media. There's a lot of commentary around Israel is portrayed as the aggressor, Iran is the victim in many ways, and also as the David against the Goliath fighting back. There was a headline in today's Vedomosti, a sober business newspaper, pro-Kremlin, of course, sober business newspaper, saying Iran now has control over the skies above Israel, which is counter to how the West views it. Israel's attack on Iran and the potential Russian response is very much one of the Kremlin should not and can't get involved in this conflict. Although various alliances and deals have been made between Russia and Iran, they've been very much supply side deals. Iran supplying drones and missiles for Russia in exchange for oil, in exchange for some technology, etc. There was no actual military alliance signed, and the Russian commentators have been at pains to keep pointing this out. They do not want the Kremlin to get sucked into some war in Iran fighting Israel, and I can't see that happening. Russia analysts have said that this is likely to happen. There's also strains in the Iran-Russia alliance which are worth noting, Dom. The first strain is that Russia actually needs Iran a lot less now than it did do a couple of years ago when it was in the first year and the second year of the war in Ukraine, when it really needed these Shahed drones, which are then fired dozens and hundreds of them at Ukrainian cities, and it needed Iran's missiles as well. Russia now gets a lot of these missiles and artillery shells from North Korea. It's also ramped up its own production of missiles, and it's also licensed the Shahed drone and produces hundreds of these drones a day itself at a factory outside Kazan. From that point of view, it needs Iran less than previously. Also, it's worth remembering that the collapse of the Syrian regime in November also fractured the relationship between Iran and Russia. Russia, if you remember, your listeners may remember, the Russian military and air force put up some resistance to the rebels as they raced towards Damascus in November, and then melted away when it was clear that the regime wasn't going to put up much of a fight of its own. And the Kremlin and Russian observers at the time blamed a lack of will from Iran to back up its puppet government and Assad for the collapse of the Assad regime. So that really strained ties there. So again, you have that coming into play about, how far the Kremlin wants to go in helping Iran in a war against Israel. A couple of other interesting points around this. Hamish has already mentioned the spike in oil prices, about 15-17% in the last few days. That is very important to Russia. It relies on oil and gas revenues to fund its economy, to pay for its war in Ukraine. It's had to downgrade its economic output, its GDP this year because of soft oil prices linked to various overproduction and OPEC strategies. So it's the Kremlin will be thankful for that boost. The Israeli attacks on Iran and their apparent success and their ingenuity has also got these the military bloggers, the Russian military bloggers, fizzing again, and they're drooling over the success of the Israel military machine, as they often do. They look to Israel as sort of martial state in awe at its success. And they've compared the Kremlin attack in Ukraine in 2022 very unfavorably. Said if Israel can take on Iran in such a manner, how can Russia fail so poorly in 2022 to capture Ukraine? There's quite a lot of this going around on Telegram and just filtering into some of the mainstream news websites as well. As we know, the Kremlin allows these pro-war commentators to let off steam. It relies on them as a sort of a valve to release tension, and it knows generally they're on side in terms of they agree with the greater Russia project that Putin has going on. And it's also useful to the Kremlin because it makes Putin look like the sane peacemaker that he wants to be seen as. The last interesting point I just want to make on this Russia, Iran, Israel issue here is that this is probably muckraking to a degree, but it's worth considering. There were some reports a couple of days ago in some of the more fringe Russian and Iranian press that some of the Iranian officials have been using back channels to talk to the Kremlin about potential sanctuary in Russia if it gets too hot to handle in Iran. This hasn't happened yet and may well never happen, but it is worth considering that the Kremlin has form on this sort of thing. It did spirit out Assad and his family from Damascus as the rebels were right outside the city in November. And it does, one of its key alliance-making points is its ability to protect puppet government leaders, alliance leaders. It did this in Syria, it's done this before, it's got this promise to do so for various African puppet states as well. So it's interesting in itself that this has already been discussed around the Iran scenario. Like I say, this could just be muckraking, but it is definitely an interesting angle.
Sure is. Thanks for that, James. Now, we're going to move to final thoughts shortly, but before we do, I just want to pick your brains about the St Petersburg Economic Forum. It starts today. Can you just give us an idea of why we should be paying attention to it? And then just finally, I saw this thing about an EU diplomat getting into a punch-up in Vladivostok. If you could just briefly touch on both of those, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, really quickly, Dom. So the St Petersburg Economic Forum is basically Kremlin's talk economic propaganda event of the year. It used to be dubbed Russia's Davos. That it's lost that sparkle now because there's no Western corporate or political leaders there anymore for obvious reasons. But it is still an important event for Putin to go to. He's going to be there, and he gives a sort of stump speech at the end of the 3-day Forum, and he has this Q&A session as well where he sits on a sofa. It's all very stage managed, etc. It allows him to put across some points that he wants to make. And he always has a guest. So this year he's hosting the Indonesian president, and this allows him to remind the West once again that he's not the international pariah that they would like him to be. He has his allies, etc. So this is important for him. It's very important, I'd say, for your listeners and for the newspapers to watch out for, because he normally drops something in on this Q&A. I've reported on it several years running, and there's normally something worthwhile reporting on. Obviously, this week focus will be on Iran. He may well say something about the peace process in Ukraine, etc. as well. So there's that. As for the diplomat story in Vladivostok on the coast, Far East Russia coast, this was a story reported in Spiegel yesterday. And they reported that an EU diplomat had been sent over to Vladivostok in end of May, and had finished her breakfast at her local hotel, was walking down the street to a meeting. She was there to check on EU member consulates in the city. When a car pulled up, two men jumped out and they roughed her up, they beat her up. We don't know the extent of these injuries. We do know that she's now been flown out of the country. We don't know if that's a medevac or just a general leave after this ordeal. But this has been confirmed by the delegation in Moscow, and EU embassies and Western embassies in Moscow have called a crisis meeting, emergency meeting, to discuss what they think may well have been a targeted attack. The Spiegel article did quote a Western diplomatic source saying it may well have been the Russian intelligence services trying to send a message to Western diplomats to be careful. If you're a Western diplomat or a Western journalist and you're working in Russia at the moment, or even before the war, but especially now, you're under great pressure. You're going to be under surveillance all the time. Odd things happen to you. There are warnings, pressure points, etc. And the way this has been framed by the Western embassies is that this could well have been a warning by Russia's intelligence services not to overstep their boundaries.
Shocking. Thanks, James. Okay, let's go to final thoughts. So we've got no Francis today. It's Waterloo Day today, 210 years since the famous battle. Francis is somewhere, no doubt, dressed up as Napoleon. I just hope it's not in his bedroom. So no, none of him. But Hamish, what have you got as final thoughts?
What a shocking thought that is. But my final thought is slightly away from Ukraine, although related. Some people might remember at the beginning of the conflict when there was a real concern that there would be nuclear accidents around the nuclear power stations, particularly Zaporizhzhia, that I did a bit of work with the Thompson Foundation, who do a lot of training for journalists around the world. And I know that journalists around the world will be listening to this pod, or certainly when it's in its podcast form, and there is concern about it. So I know the Thompson Foundation and myself have just reviewed that advice and that training course. They have put it out on all sorts of social media. So if there is any concerns, I suppose the final thing I'd say, and I think there's been quite a lot of talk by people who perhaps are not fully understand the situation with any potential American attack on probably Fordo or Natanz to destroy the centrifuges deep underground by what's called the massive ordnance penetrator. This would not create a nuclear chain reaction and explosion. We know that there's been virtually no radiation or contamination thus far on the strikes on the Iranian nuclear program. I'd be very surprised if there was any to be extent, but obviously people are concerned. So the Thompson Foundation course, which is all over social media at the moment, a bit of reassurance, and have a look at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Hamish. Great to hear from you again. James, where would you like to leave our listeners?
I read the Russian media every morning. Part of my, I don't know what sin I committed in previous life to have to do this, but that's part of what I have, my morning routine. And it's rather like going through the looking glass. It's an rather odd experience. There's no coverage of the outrageous bombings in Kyiv, for example. It's full of interviews with ministers talking about the latest technical advances on the battlefield and healthcare. This morning there was a story about how new Russian healthcare machines can spot cancer in five minutes, etc. Stories of various soldiers' bravery and happy Russian people shopping in supermarkets filled with products at an even price, etc. That stuff's all fairly standard. But there's an interesting story that seeped into the Russian media this week around the new head of the British MI6 intelligence service, Blaise Metrovelli, who some Russian commentators now claim is the daughter of a Ukrainian emigre to Britain. They claim they dug up some evidence online to prove this, and this is all part of the pro-Ukraine Nazi conspiracy that Britain, the old enemy in Russians' eyes, is pushing. So, interesting story there about how the Russian media is spinning the appointment of the new head of MI6.
Is that going to be of interest, the whole kind of intelligence world? And as much as this country culturally we love the sort of Bond movies and all that sort of stuff, so anything really to do with the agencies gets a free run at the press. But is it of interest to ordinary Russians? Are they going to give us stuff whether the new head has anything to do with any Ukrainian heritage?
I think it just builds out the picture the Kremlin want to portray that this is one big conspiracy, like everyone is focused on Russia, stamping out Russia rather than worrying about Britain's more worried about Russia than it is about China or Iran, etc. This is building that picture, and the way that they can twist it is by claiming that the new head of MI6 has a Ukrainian background and just dropping that into the mainstream media for people to chew over.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Adamora. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.